At 0600 hours on October 19, 1942, 4 days before the Second Battle of El Alamein began, Lieutenant Tony Ayrton watched soldiers of the Royal Engineers stack empty gasoline cans in precise rows south of the British defensive line. The cans were arranged to look like supply dumps when photographed from the air. Each dump contained thousands of cans, some partially filled with sand for weight, most completely empty. From ground level, the deception was obvious. From 10,000 feet, which was where German reconnaissance aircraft photographed British positions, the dumps looked like massive fuel stockpiles, suggesting British forces were building up for offensive operations. 2 miles north, carpenter crews were finishing construction of dummy vehicles, trucks made from wood frames, canvas, and scrap materials that looked convincing from above. Each dummy required approximately 6 hours of work by 2 soldiers using basic carpentry tools. The dummies were positioned in staging areas that suggested British logistics preparations for southern attack. Meanwhile, real supply dumps were being built in the northern sector, hidden under camouflage nets and disguised as existing installations. This was Operation Bertram, the British deception plan for El Alamein. Unlike American deception operations that would later use inflatable equipment, Bertram relied on carpentry, canvas, and turning garbage into convincing fakes. The operation was designed by British camouflage units, including the Camouflage Development and Training Center at Fayed, Egypt. Among the personnel involved was Jasper Maskelyne, a stage magician who had volunteered for military service and been assigned to camouflage duties. Maskelyne's involvement in Operation Bertram has been debated by historians. Post-war, Maskelyne claimed substantial responsibility for Bertram's planning and execution. His autobiography described elaborate deceptions involving hidden armies and massive misdirection. Military records suggest his role was more limited. He worked in camouflage units that contributed to Bertram, but was not the primary planner. Regardless of individual credit, Bertram demonstrated how stage magic principles, misdirection, illusion, forcing perspective could be applied to military operations. The strategic situation in October 1942 made deception critical. General Bernard Montgomery commanded British 8th Army defending El Alamein line approximately 60 miles west of Alexandria, Egypt. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commanded German-Italian Panzer Army Africa, attempting to break through to the Nile Delta. The two armies had fought to stalemate through summer 1942. Montgomery was planning offensive to break the stalemate and drive Axis forces westward. The offensive required concentrating British armor and artillery in the northern sector where terrain favored tanks, but concentrating forces would be obvious to German reconnaissance, giving Rommel time to reinforce defensive positions and position reserves. Bertram's goal was to conceal British offensive preparations and misdirect German intelligence about where and when the attack would occur. The deception had 3 components: hide the real attack force in the north, create a fake attack force in the south, and suggest the offensive would begin later than actually planned. Hiding the real attack force required innovative camouflage. British needed to position approximately 1,000 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces, and hundreds of vehicles in the northern sector without German reconnaissance detecting the buildup. Moving this equipment into position would take weeks. During those weeks, German aircraft would photograph British positions daily. The equipment had to be hidden in plain sight. The solution was Sunshield, a camouflage technique using wooden frames covered with canvas to make tanks look like trucks from the air. A Sunshield was built as a collapsible frame that fit over a tank. The frame followed the outline of a 3-ton truck. Canvas was stretched over the frame and painted to match truck colors. From above, a tank with Sunshield looked like a truck. From ground level within a few hundred yards, the deception was obvious. But German reconnaissance aircraft photographing from several thousand feet altitude could not distinguish Sunshields from real trucks. Building 1,000 Sunshields required enormous effort. Each shield used approximately 100 feet of timber, 200 square feet of canvas, paint, and hardware. Construction required skilled carpenters because the frames had to be sturdy enough to withstand desert winds, but light enough for tank crews to erect and collapse quickly. The frames were prefabricated in workshops, transported to forward areas, assembled on site, and fitted over tanks as they arrived. The camouflage worked because British positions already contained hundreds of actual trucks. German reconnaissance had been photographing these trucks for weeks. When tanks with sunshields were added to the same areas, German intelligence saw more trucks not suspicious because logistics required trucks. The tanks were hiding in truck parks, invisible because they looked like what was supposed to be there. The concealment was maintained for weeks. As tanks arrived in northern sector through September and early October, they were immediately fitted with sunshields. German reconnaissance photographed increasing numbers of trucks in northern areas, but interpreted this as normal logistics buildup, not attack preparation. The tanks remained under sunshields until the night before the attack, when crews collapsed the frames and prepared for combat. Artillery concealment used similar techniques. British artillery pieces were positioned in the north and covered with camouflage nets that matched surrounding desert. Dummy artillery pieces, wooden frames shaped like guns, were positioned in southern areas to suggest artillery was being concentrated there. German reconnaissance photographed what appeared to be artillery buildup in the south while missing the real artillery concentration in the north. Creating the fake attack force in the south required building an entire phantom logistics network. The centerpiece was a dummy water pipeline. British engineers began constructing what appeared to be water pipeline extending south from the coast toward inland positions. The pipeline was visible from the air, a cleared path with partially installed pipes. But the pipes were empty gasoline cans strung together on wooden posts. The cans were painted to look like metal pipes from altitude. German reconnaissance photographed the pipeline under construction and calculated it would not be completed until early November based on visible progress rates. The calculation influenced German assessment of British offensive timing. A major offensive would require water supplies for troops and vehicles. If British were building pipeline to supply offensive in the south, the offensive would not begin until pipeline was completed. German intelligence estimated British attack could not occur before early November. This gave Rommel approximately 2 additional weeks to prepare defenses and position reserves. The actual British attack would begin October 23, 2 weeks before Germans expected. The dummy supply dumps in the south completed the deception. British engineers stacked thousands of empty gasoline cans in areas visible to aerial reconnaissance. The stacks were arranged to look like fuel dumps. Some cans were filled with sand to prevent wind from scattering them. The dumps suggested massive fuel stockpiling for southern offensive. German intelligence calculated fuel quantities visible in photographs and assessed British were preparing armored offensive in the south using the fuel they were stockpiling. The dumps were almost entirely empty cans. Real fuel was being stockpiled in northern sector, hidden in underground tanks, dispersed in small caches, and camouflaged. But German reconnaissance saw massive dumps in south and minimal visible fuel in north. The obvious conclusion was that the attack was planned for the south. Dummy vehicles supported the southern deception. British engineers built approximately 400 dummy tanks and vehicles from wood frames, canvas, and scrap materials. The dummies were positioned in southern staging areas starting in late September. German reconnaissance photographed them and counted increasing numbers of tanks in the south. But the tanks were wooden frames that weighed less than 200 pounds and could be moved by 2 soldiers. Real tanks were in the north under sunshields. The deception required careful timing. The dummy equipment in the south had to appear gradually to match realistic reinforcement schedules. If 400 tanks suddenly appeared, German intelligence might suspect deception. But if tanks appeared steadily over 3 weeks, the buildup seemed authentic. British camouflage units managed the appearance schedule, carefully adding dummy vehicles on a schedule that matched expected reinforcement rates. Simultaneously, real equipment had to be moved north without detection. Tanks moved at night using routes away from German observation posts. During daylight, they remained under sunshields or in camouflaged positions. Artillery was positioned at night and covered by dawn. Supplies were moved in small convoys that looked like routine logistics. The northern buildup was conducted in plain view, but disguised as normal activity. The deception extended to radio communications. British signals units maintained normal radio traffic patterns in southern sector, while increasing traffic in northern sector gradually. The traffic patterns suggested headquarters and combat units were dispersing south while maintaining defensive positions in north. German signals intelligence, which monitored British radio transmissions to track unit locations, was misled by the artificial traffic patterns. German intelligence responded exactly as British planners hoped. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed apparent British buildup in the south. Signals intelligence suggested units moving south. The dummy pipeline indicated offensive could not occur before early November. German intelligence assessed British would attack in the south in mid-November. Rommel positioned his reserves accordingly, keeping mobile forces in the south to counter expected British armor thrust. The German assessment was documented in intelligence summaries captured after the battle. German intelligence had noted British preparations in the north, but interpreted them as defensive improvements, not offensive concentration. They had seen the tanks in the north, but counted them as trucks based on reconnaissance photographs. The Sunshield camouflage had worked perfectly. German counts of British armor in the north underestimated actual numbers by approximately 60%. German counts of British armor in the south overestimated numbers by approximately 400%. On the night of October 22, 23, British forces removed the sunshields and prepared for attack. Tank crews collapsed the wooden frames and loaded them on trucks for disposal. Artillery removed camouflage nets. Infantry moved into assault positions. The northern sector transformed from apparently quiet defensive area to concentrated offensive force in several hours of darkness. German reconnaissance flying over British positions on October 23 would have seen the transformation, but by then the artillery barrage was beginning. The barrage started at 2140 hours on October 23. Nearly 1,000 artillery pieces fired simultaneously for 15 minutes. The bombardment targeted German defensive positions in the north positions Rommel had not heavily reinforced because German intelligence expected attack in the south. The bombardment created gaps in German defensive lines that British infantry and engineers exploited to clear paths through minefields. British armor advanced through the gaps starting at 200 hours on October 24. The tanks that German reconnaissance had been photographing as trucks for weeks were now in combat. The concentration of armor in the north surprised German defenders who had expected quiet sector in the north and major attack in the south. German reserves were positioned wrongly in the south, where the dummy buildup suggested the attack would come. Repositioning reserves to counter British attack in the north required hours and exposed German forces to British air attack during daylight movement. The tactical surprise did not guarantee British victory. The battle lasted 12 days and involved intense fighting. But the surprise gave British forces initial advantage. German defenses in the north were weaker than they would have been if Rommel had known British attack was coming there. German reserves were positioned wrongly and had to be moved under fire. The confusion from realizing the southern buildup was fake and the northern buildup was real disrupted German response in the critical first 24 hours. Rommel was not present when the battle began. He had left North Africa on medical leave on September 23. He was in Austria recovering from illness when British attack began. German command in North Africa was temporarily held by General Georg Stumme. Stumme died of heart attack during the first day of battle, creating additional command confusion. Rommel flew back to North Africa and arrived October 25. But by then, British had achieved initial breakthrough. Rommel's counterattacks could not reverse British gains. By November 4th, Rommel was withdrawing westward. The battle was British victory. Operation Bertram's success was documented in post-battle assessments. British intelligence analyzed captured German documents and interrogated German prisoners. The assessments showed German intelligence had been deceived by Bertram completely. German commanders believed British attack would come in the south in mid-November. When attack came in the north on October 23, German forces were positioned wrongly and reserves were out of position. The tactical surprise contributed significantly to British success. The techniques used in Bertram's sunshields: dummy equipment, fake supply dumps, False radio traffic were studied and refined for future operations. British deception units used similar methods in Italy and northwestern Europe. American forces adopted some techniques for Pacific operations. The fundamental principles: misdirection, creating false signatures detectable by enemy reconnaissance, maintaining deception over weeks, became standard deception doctrine. Jasper Maskelyne's role in Bertram has been subject to debate and exaggeration. Maskelyne's autobiography, published in 1949, claimed he was chief planner of Bertram and other deceptions in North Africa. He described elaborate operations involving hidden artillery, fake tanks, and misdirection on massive scale. The autobiography presented Maskelyne as central figure in British deception operations. Military records tell more modest story. Maskelyne was assigned to camouflage units in North Africa from 1941 through 1943. He contributed to various camouflage and deception efforts, including Bertram. But he was not chief planner or commander of deception operations. His rank was sergeant. He was not in position to direct major operations. The actual Bertram planning was done by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Richardson and other staff officers under Montgomery's direction. Maskelyne's exaggerations do not diminish his contributions. He was skilled in stage illusion techniques and applied those skills effectively to military camouflage. His understanding of perspective, misdirection, and creating convincing illusions from crude materials was valuable. But his autobiography overstated his role, creating myth of magician single-handedly deceiving Rommel through elaborate tricks. The reality was that Bertram was collaborative effort involving hundreds of soldiers building thousands of props over 6 weeks under direction of staff officers who understood both deception principles and German intelligence methods. The logistics of Bertram were substantial. Approximately 700 men worked directly on deception preparations. They built 1,000 Sunshields, 400 dummy vehicles, fake supply dumps containing 10,000 empty cans, dummy artillery positions, and the fake pipeline. The work required carpentry shops and canvas supplies, paint, timber, hardware, and transportation. The materials were mostly scrap empty gasoline cans that would have been discarded, scrap timber from packing crates, canvas from worn tents. The ability to turn garbage into convincing military equipment was central to Bertram's success. The cost in resources was minimal compared to conventional military operations. Building a dummy tank cost approximately £10 in materials and 12 man-hours of labor. Building a Sunshield cost approximately £5 and 8 man-hours. The total cost of Bertram's physical deception was probably under £50,000, equivalent to the cost of perhaps 10 actual tanks. The return on investment was tactical surprise, worth far more than the material cost. The German failure to detect Bertram revealed limitations in German intelligence methods. German reconnaissance relied heavily on aerial photography interpreted by analysts who assumed what they saw was real. The Germans had sophisticated photo interpretation capabilities, but lacked context for assessing whether observed equipment was genuine. They counted vehicles visible in photographs without considering that vehicles might be disguised tanks, or dummy vehicles might be counted as real. German signals intelligence was similarly vulnerable. The Germans monitored British radio traffic and tracked unit locations based on transmission sources, but they assumed radio traffic reflected actual unit positions. British could create false signatures by transmitting from fake locations while maintaining radio silence at real positions. The German intelligence collection was extensive, but the analysis assumed enemy was not conducting systematic deception. The German intelligence failure was also partly doctrinal. German military culture emphasized direct action and considered deception somewhat dishonorable, acceptable in small doses but not as fundamental strategy. British military culture was more comfortable with deception as legitimate military tool. This cultural difference meant Germans were less likely to suspect large-scale deception was being conducted against them. The timing of Bertram was also fortunate. The operation was conducted during a period when German reconnaissance capability was degraded. Luftwaffe units in North Africa had been weakened by transfers to other theaters. Reconnaissance flights were less frequent in October 1942 than earlier in the year. This gave British more opportunity to conduct deception without constant aerial monitoring that might have detected inconsistencies. The success of Bertram influenced subsequent deception operations. Operation Bodyguard for D-Day used similar principles: create fake armies, position them where enemy expects attack, hide real armies elsewhere. The Ghost Army in northwestern Europe used different materials, inflatable tanks instead of wooden frames, but followed same principles of creating signatures detectable by enemy reconnaissance. The techniques pioneered in desert of North Africa were refined and expanded for operations in Europe. The legacy of Bertram is that deception works when it confirms enemy expectations rather than challenging them. German intelligence expected British attack would come in the south because terrain there favored armor operations. Bertram created evidence supporting this expectation: dummy tanks in the south, fake supply dumps, incomplete pipelines suggesting timing. Germans accepted the evidence because it matched what they already believed. The real attack in the north was unexpected because evidence suggested otherwise. The principle applies broadly. Effective deception does not require elaborate technology or sophisticated systems. It requires understanding what enemy intelligence is looking for and providing evidence that confirms enemies' preconceptions while hiding actual intentions. Bertram achieved this using empty gasoline cans, wooden frames, and canvas. The materials were crude, but the effect was decisive. The soldiers who built Bertram's deceptions, carpenters constructing sunshields, engineers stacking empty cans, painters camouflaging dummy vehicles, were not recognized for their contributions immediately. They were performing support duties, while infantry and armor received credit for winning the battle. But without the deception work, the battle might have been longer, costier, or might have failed. The tactical surprise created by weeks of patient construction work gave Montgomery's forces the initial advantage that contributed to ultimate victory. The carpenters and painters who turned garbage into convincing fake armies did not have the skills traditionally associated with combat operations. They were support personnel using peacetime trades, carpentry, painting, canvas work for military purposes, but their work was as important as the work of soldiers who fired weapons. The fake tanks they built deceived German intelligence as effectively as real tanks would have defeated German armor. The empty gasoline cans they stacked influenced German strategic planning as much as real supplies would have sustained British operations. This was the lesson of Operation Bertram. Sometimes the most effective military operations involve carpentry and garbage collection rather than combat. Sometimes the decisive contribution comes from soldiers building wooden frames in workshops rather than soldiers advancing under fire. Sometimes winning battles requires making the enemy see what is not there rather than destroying what is there. And sometimes a stage magician's understanding of illusion and misdirection is more valuable than traditional military expertise. The Battle of El Alamein was won through many factors: British numerical superiority, Montgomery's planning, Eighth Army's fighting capability, German fuel shortages, but tactical surprise from Operation Bertram contributed significantly. The surprise came from 6 weeks of work by soldiers who built an entire fake army from scrap materials while hiding a real army in plain sight. The work that turned empty oil cans into supply dumps, wooden frames into tanks, and canvas into convincing illusions. The work that made German intelligence see British attack coming from the wrong direction at the wrong time. The work that proved military deception required more imagination than technology and more patience than sophistication,